Hi everyone. Uh, this video is basically designed to encourage you to look for the subtleties within light and how light behaves in the world and how light affects the way we see things and the way things are formed. So there are certain principles that we all know or we're aware of. What I hope to show you in this video is to encourage you to think about the intricacies of different tones and light, and not just the simplicity of there's a light side and there's a dark side. It's those subtleties and observing the world and looking at how light behaves is what makes us better as artists, if you like. So that is the intention of this video. It's going to be a mixture of little demonstrations and some examples as well. But at the end of the day, what I want you to do is look at the world around you and look at the fact that it's much more complicated in terms of the way light behaves than sometimes we even think ourselves. Okay, what I'm doing now is I've just drawn a very simple circle here, a bit rugged around the edge there, but basic circle. And we're talking about light and form, and light and space in particular, the distance, the illusion of distance that we can create. So if I was simply to begin by shading this circle, so I'm going to give this side a deeper shadow on that side, okay? So, you know, we all probably are aware of this idea. So you have a darker side to the circle, you have this lighter side here. What I'm going to do is create a slightly darker edge to this side, okay? So what we have in the case of a circle, when we turn it into a sphere, into a solid form, is that we have shadow, highlight, or light area with a highlight, and then it curves away, of course, from that light back into shadow. Very often this shadow on this side will not be as intense as the shadow on this side. So actually what I'll do is I'll just make a little bit deeper tone happen down this side, okay? So we have created something that has some illusion here of being a ball rather than a circle. However, if I was to contain that circle in a rectangle here, so we'll give it a little frame here and decide that what I'm going to do is make this really quite dark. So I'm making the surrounding area considerably darker. So it might take a little while, but we'll hopefully see it emerge in here if I scratch this in. I'm not being overly neat at the minute with my pencil technique because what's more important for this exercise is to see the relationships. So you can perhaps see as I darken this around the outside here, all the way down there. So we've now contained this sphere, this solid kind of ball in this darker frame. And what I want to point out now is how that changes the relationship of this area here and this area. So there's a difference beginning to show in the sense that there's less contrast there. So in other words, here, there isn't so much contrast between the tone on the ball and the tone in the background because I've made the background darker. So if I make that more deeper, if you like, more shaded. So if you watch, I'm shading across that ball again, a couple of times, bringing down the tone And what's happening, of course, is the tone is coming closer to the tone of the background. So I'm fading it out slightly as we go across to the left hand side. I want this side still to be darker than the left if I can. But I'm really pushing it now. You can see I'm beginning to push it and push it until the tone, the darkness of the ball on the right hand side is nearly the same, but not quite, as the background. Whereas I'm leaving the left hand side a little bit lighter. And hopefully what you're seeing, in fact, what I'm doing is, you might be able to see, is I'm just washing over the whole thing with my pencil until the ball shadow is barely noticeable from the shadow of the tone of the background. And what you have here, of course, then is the illusion that this side of the ball is disappearing back away from us, whereas this area here is leaping forward or jumping forward. So if we work that a wee bit more, for instance, I put a little bit of mid-tone shading around here. And what I'm going to do is try to leave a tiny little bit of light here. So I'm shrinking the amount of very, very light, and I'm making more of a mid-tone there, you can see. So what I'm trying to create is a little bit of highlight right there. And of course, we could blend this and blend this for a long time. But really, the essence of what I'm trying to point out is space and the illusion of distance and things retreating away from us is based upon the relationship of tone. If there's high contrast, it will appear to be coming forward. If it's a low contrast, low difference between one and the other, then it will be pushing back. It will merge together, and our brains will read that as being further away. Okay, so for instance, if I then was to come back to the background on this side and make it really, really dark, as dark as I can. Remember, I'm making this dark beside what was actually much lighter on this side. And you can see that that is enhancing the notion of this side being closer or coming out, as it were, towards us. So if I really punch in a dark section across this left-hand side here in the background, you can see the contrast here, throwing this edge forward towards us, whereas this is disappearing back, as it were, into the mists of shadow. Okay, so that's an important element to consider. Here's an example of, if you like, the complexity of light. When we consider light and form and space, and how our brains understand how form moves around in space and depth and so on. If we look at a sphere, which is a fairly simple form in some ways, but yet look at the complexity of the variation of tone that exists in it. So in other words, a lot of people often, when they paint or draw a sphere, simply have a light side and a dark side and maybe kind of blend them together somewhere in the middle. But if we really analyze it, you will see that there are many aspects to this thing. First of all, for example, and what I'm going to try to do maybe is perhaps just draw some lines to indicate what's going on here. We have, for example, the light area. We'll start with the light area, which obviously is the area which is catching the light. Okay, so the light's coming seemingly from the top right in this image, this picture. So I've just drawn a line around the area that would generally be catching that light. Okay, so when we think about highlight is actually a reflection of whatever light source is there. So if it was the sun, or if it was a spotlight and it was striking a shiny object, or maybe not even such a shiny object, it's that reflection of the actual light itself. So that's what the highlight is, which is slightly different. So I'll put a ring around that just to remind us about that. Therefore, that highlight will move depending on where the light source is, of course. So if you're drawing something or painting something, be aware of not just shooting down a piece of light, and there's there's a little highlight on it. The highlight must make sense. So if the light is coming from the top right, then your highlight will be in a certain place. If it's coming from below, then the highlight, of course, will be there. So that's very important. I'm just going to undo what I've done so far, get rid of those lines. If we then look at the next section, which is halftone, makes sense that basically it's an area, as I draw these lines, that is midway between dark and light, if you like. You can see the lines that I've just drawn there. So they're one step down from the light area, and they usually come in the case of a sphere, it usually reaches to the halfway mark. In other words, to the point where the light, the object bends back again. So you can see in this ball, it's bending around, and at this point, it starts to bend back in towards the bottom end of the ball, if you like. So in other words, the light that's moving and striking that is traveling in straight lines, remember? So if it's striking there, it's still able to touch that area, but if it gets to that point, it's shooting on past. So it's not able to touch the area beneath. And consequently, that's what's known as the shadow core. So I'll put a lighter area in here just to show. So this strip, just right in here, in other words, just above that white line, is the shadow core. You can imagine again the lines of light, straight lines striking, but eventually they'll bypass it. They can't touch that area here. So therefore, that's going to be the darkest part of the whole object. So what I'm going to do, hopefully, is undo all of this again so we can see more clearly and work down to the lower part. We then have shadow, which is kind of like the equivalent of halftone. You have the core, the darkest, where no light really can touch. You have then an area which is actually fractionally lighter. So I'm going to draw a little dark line around this area and this area. Do you see that sort of area here that I'm working in? And one of the reasons is that light is beginning to come off the surface, in this case, the table or whatever that this ball is sitting on, and bouncing back across that. So in other words, the lines of light are coming down, they're hitting the surface here and bouncing back up and striking it. So the darkness is not as extreme as that core. In other words, the bend here has started, therefore that allows this face to get light striking from below to begin to anyway. So if I undo all this again, go back to nice clean start and move down to what we call reflected light. So that's a much more intense version. In other words, that's clearly where the sunlight or the light hits the surface, the table, the ground, whatever, bounces back to the lower part and creates quite a light area. That reflected light will normally not be as intense as the light in the original light, as it were, at the top of the object, but it is noticeable depending on what the object's made of. If it's made of something shiny, of course, it will beam back the light maybe a little more than a matte finish. So you have a number of steps that happen in that form, if you like. Then we come to shadow. Of course, we have the cast shadow. In other words, the shadow that's cast from the object. That makes sense. So that will be where the light beams. In other words, the light, if I can draw it here, is coming from above. It gets to the point where it can't go any further here and here, and that is where the edge of the shadow exists. So that makes sense. If the light source moved around until it was a lower angle, in other words, instead of being up here somewhere in the top right, it went way down, just like sunset. If we have a low sun in the sky, we have longer shadows. That makes sense. Then we have, interestingly, what's called the accent, or sometimes called occlusion shadow. And that is the darkest part right beneath the object. And it's so far beneath that any reflected light can't actually get in there, as it were. So you will always have an even more intense dark right close to the object itself. And that's important because if you're trying to paint or draw forms, to create a good illusion, it's these little subtle differences that make it convincing. So in other words, some people say, oh, well, I'll paint in a shadow, and from the edge of the object to the edge of the shadow is the same tone, is the same darkness. But in reality, there is an accent that happens right tucked underneath, just like there's an accent of highlight in a sense. So you need those two little changes to make the object and the form, if you like, convincing. So if we have a think about that when we're certainly when you're drawing and painting. So here's another illusion, if you like, or another example of how light relates to space or the illusion of space. So for example, if I was to create here a little simple shape, okay, like a folding screens, as it were. So if I do this, there, I'm going to bring a line down here. So have that tapering back like that, have that tapering back like this, so on, have that coming out. So we have a set of shapes there. At the moment, the illusion isn't there because there's no real sense of space, as it were. So if I was, for example, to shade in this side quite dark, so I'm gonna, this panel, let's call it a panel, I have that really quite a deep tone. Just get right up into the corner here. And just tidy that up slightly. As I say, my pencil work is not designed to be super neat for this exercise, but what I want is to simply block in this tone here. So we have that tone, this tone here, which I'm going to leave fairly light. What I might do is put a little indication of shading as it disappears back there. Then in this area here, what I'm going to do is leave this slightly light, but as we come in here, have a little bit of tone, a wee bit of deeper tone there. Not as dark as the original panel on the left of it, but a little bit lighter. And what this does is reinforce the illusion of space. What I mean is that because what I've done here is reduce the contrast. In other words, the contrast between these two is less. They're more similar in tone, whereas the contrast between that and that is very high. And therefore, where you have a high contrast, a moment where very light meets very dark, another very stark contrast, it will appear to jump forward towards us, as it were. Whereas when you have little or less contrast, it will appear to recede. So therefore, we have this illusion enhanced that we are walking in, as it were, to a corner of a room, and this is a corner sticking out. And indeed, that illusion, just like the ball, would probably be reinforced even more if I was to take and strengthen the background. If I was to turn the background tone into a very dark area, in other words, like I did with the ball, if I frame this up and surround it by a very dark tone, you can see that makes that section really come forward out towards us, whereas here that's not happening. Another reason it's not happening is the light here on the edge of this one is similar, if not the same, to the white of the page in the background. So the only thing is the line defining it there. So if I was to change that, that would change also. If I was to suddenly say, well, let's have quite a strong background where it meets the edge of this one, then in a sense that reinforces the edge of this particular panel coming forward. In other words, if you look at this edge here, it jumps out even more than it did a moment ago. So the extreme shapes and forms are becoming more obvious the more extreme the tone becomes. Okay, so having seen those two little examples of how we can control tone and create the illusion of space, I thought I might show you a couple of examples. So if you bear with me, hopefully we'll find one example. The classic example here, hopefully you can see that, is this landscape photograph. And it's a perfect example of what we also call aerial perspective. So light is an important part of that, but you can see that principle, if you like, that the stronger sudden contrasts or more sudden differences in tone happen near the front, closer to us. As we go further back, obviously the tones are getting lighter, but more importantly, it's more difficult to see the change between one tone and another. So the range becomes narrower, where it's more sudden towards the middle and the foreground. And again, a lot of this is determined by the light of the situation. So on a different day in this place, sunset or sunrise, there might be something different going on. So it's not going to be identical, but generally the rule is that higher contrast will happen closer to us. So I have one other example again. Hopefully I find this on the screen. So this, I hope, you will see this. This is one of the Dutch 17th century still life painters. One of great examples of control, if you like. But what I've done is taken the color out of it, so we can see how this artist has created the feeling of what they want us to see it in the front, if you like, and what they want us to see further back. Now, of course, we know certain things are at the front because they're overlapping the things. So in other words, a piece of fruit here, we know is tucked in behind this jar. But apart from that, if you look at the high contrast of those objects, like the pot and like the orange down here at the bottom, the pith of the orange is really quite light. Then you have sudden darkness right beside it. So the surrounding area around the orange is a very extreme black, white, dark light thing. If you look maybe towards the left, where the grapes are beginning to go behind some other objects, you'll see that what they've done is decrease the contrast. So the stem running back into the shadows obviously isn't as bright as the orange over here, but that difference in tonal range pushes it back and not only creates the illusion of shadows, but the illusion of space also. So those are things, those are principles that you can apply in your own painting as well. And hopefully not just black, white, dark light, but be subtle about the way you measure the different values of your light in a painting as well. One of the important things to keep in mind is that how we perceive the world and how we perceive objects and their relationship to each other depends very much on how we perceive or understand light and how light behaves around objects or on top of objects and so on. And it's not just a matter of light and shade, black and white. there are very, very subtle things that go on within tones and the values of light within objects that tell our brains that it's a very simple object like a box, or maybe a very complicated object like a piece of architecture or a sculpture, because the light plays across these objects in all sorts of different ways. And even in most simple objects, there are subtle changes in tone that sometimes we ignore. But if we can observe those and see those, and indeed record them as artists through our drawing, then our transferring of the world becomes so much better when we make our paintings or our drawings or whatever it is. So what I'm hopefully going to do here, I'll hopefully going to bring up some examples here so you can see in front of you here. I'll just begin this slideshow in a full scale. So there we go. These are just pieces of white card that I've folded up and arranged in various ways. And I've zoomed into most of them to make you look, if you like, at those subtleties I'm talking about. We know, for instance, this is a piece of white cardboard which is folded into like a zigzag shape. And obviously, the light's coming from our right-hand side. Therefore, the faces of the card that are facing towards that right side will be light, of course. The face which is bending or pointing away or partially away from that light will be darker. But the angle at which they're facing the light can be very subtly different. So in other words, this light area here isn't quite as intense as this, because this fold isn't exactly on the same plane as this one. This one's bent slightly differently. You can see if you look at the top edge that that angle is not quite exactly the same as that. The other thing you will see is when you look at the darker side, the tone diminishes as it goes across, or increases, I should say. It becomes slightly lighter. There's a subtle change from that bottom corner, for instance, there, where it's probably the darkest of the bit of card. It fades out gradually, becoming lighter, 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 dissolving into slightly lighter here, and possibly the lightest up at the top there. So light skids across the object. It's not just a matter of there's a light bit, there's a dark bit. And it's those subtleties that help our brain understand what's happening and what direction things move in and so on. Now, the reason for this is twofold. One is that the light skids across. The second, of course, is the light is striking this face and bouncing back onto that, creating a slightly lighter, if you like, reflected light compared to this far side where the light's not able to get to. So therefore, we see a very high contrast here, maybe slightly lower contrast here. But those subtle changes make us understand so much more about this object, or indeed this piece of card. Look at this one. Pardon me. This piece of card is obviously underneath the upper piece of card, like a tent nearly. And obviously that piece of card is casting a certain amount of shadow onto the one below. But again, if you look at the shadow in this underneath piece of card, it is lighter here and becomes darker the further back into the space it goes. And obviously that's because the light is able to get at it out here when it's exposed to the light. As it disappears under the shield of this one, it slowly becomes darker until it's tucked away in there, away from the light much, much more. But that gradation helps us to lead our eyes. Our brain reads that direction, that there's something moving, as it were, slowly backwards, and it tends to enhance the illusion of that piece of card being underneath the other one. Likewise, just looking at the tones that we see, look at this tone. The tone up in this upper right side is virtually white. It appears white in this photograph. The tone on that side obviously is darker because it's facing away from the light. That makes sense, of course. Then if we look at the tone here, as we've said, that's slightly darker, but not quite as dark as that, because that face is pointing upwards. It's lying looking up the way towards the general direction of where the light's coming from. So it's catching a little bit of light. This is catching much less light because it's turned nearly completely away from the light, but not quite. So determining the tone depends on what angle or how acute the angle is in relation to the light. So if you look down here, you will see another light area here where this fold goes up and over. Look at how dark this is because it's facing away from the light. That's so much lighter, but it's not as light as this one because this one is looking straight at the light, as it were. This is not looking straight towards with the light source. It's looking over here, but the light's coming across from the right-hand side and catching it to a certain extent. So depending on the planes and how they're facing in relation to the light, you will get different tones. Therefore, when we look at these things, our brains will read complicated shapes rather than just simple dark light. If we move on to this one, similar thing going on with this. This piece of card is disappearing up underneath this almost cardboard tent here. You will see the same thing applying again. This is darker because it's lower down. You'll see a very crisp shadow there, obviously because that object is casting the shadow on top of that. So the light's coming from up here somewhere and casting a shadow below the object onto the card below. So that makes sense. But that's what tells us what's going on. And as artists, we should be looking for these things when we look at spaces. Likewise, look at this. The upper part of this card is casting the shadow onto the inner part of it itself. But interestingly, that grey is not as light as this grey. And this grey is not as light as this grey. So within this one image, we have several tones, 1, 2, 3, then 4, possibly 5, and maybe count the background, then would be 6. Not to mention the light edges. The card obviously has a thickness, and therefore the light is catching that thin edge to the card, which is quite important to the illusion also. So to be aware of all that, it would allow us to draw this or paint this in a so much more interesting and accurate way than just simply saying there's a light outside, there's a dark inside, and that's it. Measurement is the key word here, measurement of tone. This one here, I think might be the last one, a combination of what we've just looked at. In a way, we've looked at this one here. This interests me, however, if you look at what's happening here, this piece of card leaning up and touching the corner of this piece of card. And it's interesting that what happens here, look how the light on the bottom part of this piece of card is slightly lighter. You can actually see a change of tone from there, that grey to a slightly lighter grey, and then a darker grey in there. There's almost a radiating set of dark, medium, and light going on. And again, that is to do with the fact that as the object comes closer, there's less exposure to light in that space. So there's more of this casting shadow. It becomes darker. And as it gets to the point where it contacts, where it's leaning against that point, it's very, very dark and very, very crisp. You very often find that where objects touch each other, especially if they're even slightly reflective, and most objects are, you will get a point of darkness which is very crisp. As the object leans away out, in other words, there's a distance between this face and this, there's a gap that we could put our finger in there, the shadows become softer and it's almost out of focus. My memory in school was we talked about umbra and penumbra and so on. And if you move an object away, then it runs out the shadow, but the edges of the shadow appear fuzzier and out of focus. As you move it closer, it goes into focus, as you can see here, where it touches, it's almost like a crisp dark line. And that is how our brain has been conditioned to interpret these things. So we associate that with something that's touching, and that shadow with something that's maybe not quite touching. And all of these things very often are programmed, as I say, in through us in our experience in life. But as artists, we should be observing these more than simply saying, there's a shadow, there's light, and let's just paint it. It has to be as subtle as this in order to be convincing. So I would urge anyone who's concerned with space and light and drawing to think about measuring these things. And actually, they make very interesting images. You've just seen those images that I've been looking at, those beautiful. I just zoomed in on a piece of white card folded, and they almost make some very beautiful abstract images, which could in turn become paintings. So observation and accuracy is the name of the game here. So what we have here is or are three simple rectangles. I just want to sort of point out how light and tone, obviously those two things go together, creates the illusion of form or space. So they're equal rectangles, if you like. But if I take the first one and simply shade it from top corner here to bottom. So what I'm just going to do is bring that down until it's quite light here at the bottom. And as I get to the top right side, I'm beginning to intensify this. So what I'm really going to do is begin to really deepen the shadow or deepen the tone here on that top right, and slowly work the shading so that it graduates towards bottom left and becomes lighter and lighter. So I'll just keep working that. I want to get a nice subtle change of tone, so leave that bottom section pretty much as it is. Keeping the lines as straight as I can. I'm also sort of leaning over a camera here at the minute, which makes it a bit more difficult. But and then let's really intensify that dark top corner there. So keep that going. I'm going over the rectangle slightly, but in order to create this shading that's necessary, what I'll do is I'll rub that out afterwards. So from about here back, I'm going to get very, very, very dark. And really, and this is where even the pencils that we use become important, that we do get pencils that are capable of really nice dark tones. So if I was to do that, and what I'll do is I'll just take and try to rub away the rough edges, as it were, so that we see that, pardon me, as a rectangle. We just shade that and tighten that up a wee bit more there. So you can see that what we have is dark to light gradation. And the illusion that's created, if you like, is the illusion of a hole in that. In other words, you feel as if you could perhaps disappear in underneath that. In other words, in there perhaps is a pipe or if you have a tunnel of some sort, because of the gradation that's happening. And obviously, if I work at that and make that gradation more and more and more and more subtle, the illusion becomes more obvious. But you can see hopefully already that because of that deep, deep corner, there's a sense that there's a space and it could be a window perhaps, but either way, we're looking inside a space. And that changes, look how that changes from a simple white rectangle. So I have created this illusion of space through light and tone, and not just black, white, but gradations and more subtleties, if you like. If, for instance, I take my next rectangle and create something similar, except let's say I begin again with nice dark tones here in the top corner. And I'm going to relax my hand a wee bit at this point to make them lighter. So I'll just fill in that corner, coming lighter about here. And then I'm beginning to press more heavily about this point. There are a couple of little lines coming through on the board beneath, but hopefully that's not too much of a distraction. So I'm darkening here, dark, 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 then beginning to relax my hand another little bit so that it's becoming lighter. And I'll keep doing that and then begin to get darker again. So I'm going to start to press hard on my pencil right there. Quite hard, really. Nice dark corner there. And then maybe relax just as I come to the end there. So it's heavy pressure, light pressure, heavy pressure, light pressure, back to heavy pressure. And I hope that perhaps what you see or what we see happening there is the illusion of ridges, waves, if you like, or could be two roots of a tree, but there's form created there, and that space, there's a space between those. In other words, there's an illusion that we put our finger into a little space there and maybe into a little space between those two things and maybe in a space up here as well. So we create undulating space through the illusion, if you like, of or the use of tonal range, light range. So I keep stressing that space isn't just one dark object against a light object. It's the variations in between. Therefore, as artists, our job is how we can control that. What we have to do is control our pencil or our paints, and the measurement business is so important. If, for instance, I take this third rectangle, and these two I've tried very hard to be quite straight, geometric lines, neat crisscross lines. What I'm going to do here is just begin to relax my hand a bit. So I'm actually going to make lines that are slightly curved, in other words. I am varying it as well with regards to dark and light, but I'm deliberately making sort of an arc shape as I draw. And again, as I come to the bottom, perhaps I will let that become even darker. And again, this changes the illusion. The illusion of a paper being flat, as it were, changes, and the illusion of this rectangle, imagine it being a sheet of paper, a sheet of fabric, then changes direction and it folds in a different way, and it almost curves that way. And indeed, if we were able, I'm not sure if that's possible, if we were to change the shape of that, we would create the illusion perhaps of a soft piece of ragged fabric with this sort of fold in it. So you can see there that space is created there and there and there, and space equals form. Space and tonal range creates 3 dimensions. So with what began as 3 flat rectangles, they're no longer, oh well, they are, in the sense that yes, they're still flat, of course they are, but the illusion in our mind is that we've created spaces, holes, as it were, in the canvas, holes in the paper itself. What I'm doing here is I've taken and drawn 4 rectangles, random shapes, some bigger than others, side by side. So they're all flat, as it were, on the same plane. What I want to do is, by using that method that we spoke about in the last clip, of light and shade and space, we take these flat areas and change. And what I mean by that is, if I was to take this rectangle and gently shade it very, very lightly, and then again, as we come to the corner, really darken that tone. In other words, the light, the illusion, as it were, of light is disappearing as it hits there and then fades on out. And then let's take this lower rectangle, for example. What we could do is take it, begin with a slightly lighter tone here. And what we'll do is we'll make it the same tone across the whole thing first of all. And then what I'll do is I'll begin to intensify the tone up in this corner. So as the tone intensifies there and fades out, we'll make that nice and deep in there. And we'll fade that out to that side. Then we'll take, I'll just put that in a wee bit stronger actually. Like that nice dark tone right up in that corner along here, where it meets that higher rectangle. Then we'll take this little rectangle, and what we'll do is start from light there again and intensify as we come to the edge of this one. So in other words, this is a very intense dark along the side here, which slowly graduates out. So we just work it and work it. Slightly lighter pressure on my hand. Keep that nice and light on the right hand side. And then as I start to come in here, begin to press a bit more and blend those together a little bit more there. And really, really intensify it right there where it meets that line. And maybe intensify that. It's quite a fun exercise to do actually, because it's a very good bit of practice in terms of controlling pencil pressure and so on. Then if we take this one here, what I'll do here is just have a bit of fun. I'll keep that a relatively light tone there, and again just begin to intensify it up in this top corner. Work that slowly out there, and make that really deep in the corner as I've done with some of the others, and maybe actually make that a bit darker overall. What I can do now is maybe take for example this one and say, okay, well I want it to be darker. It's still going to have variation here, you can see that, but it doesn't need to go to pure white. It can actually start dark. So we're darkening that down considerably, and then in turn I'll darken the dark bits, you know, so relatively everything's coming down a little bit more tonally, and I'll explain why I'm hoping to do that, or I'm doing that in a moment. Do the same with this one, perhaps. Maybe instead of it being very light across here, we'll just take the edge of the pure white. So again, overall, it's quite a dark shape. This one could be even darker. I could try to lean on this a little bit more, actually, and make that deeper. And then in turn, make the dark area even darker. What I'm trying to do is get variations of light into these rectangles. And if you look now even at what we've got, hopefully what you're seeing and what we are seeing is the illusion again that is this tucked underneath that one. That corner of that that shape appears to be sitting on top of this one. This one is interesting because there's an illusion created, because is this disappearing underneath this one, which appears to be the case because that tends to come forward against that. That looks like it's hovering above that. Strangely enough, this looks like it's hovering above this corner, because our brains are trying to read the relationship of light and dark. If you look at this one, because I've made that all dark, it pushes it back immediately. And if you remember what we said about contrast, there's a less contrast here. This is very low contrast. The difference between this gray and this gray isn't so much, whereas the difference between that black or that dark gray and that almost white is extreme. So therefore, the illusion is that is pushed back into shadow. That tends to not jump forward. This does jump forward a bit more because of the high contrast that's going on there, the low contrast here, and the low contrast there as well. So as I can control the degrees of tone, I can control the degree of space, or the illusions of space that are happening in these shapes. The illusion of one thing on top of another, one thing below another. For instance, that area here appears to be underneath that one. So with the use of a pencil, we've created and taken 4 rectangles and created 4 rectangles that are now floating in different types of spaces. I think it's useful when we think about tone that we try to see it almost like sound or like music. Obviously, if you think of light and shade in music, if you listen to any sort of music, you know, sometimes that music is played within a very limited range. In other words, let's say it's a piano, it might be being played way down in the low notes, and that's where it stays because that, if you like, is the mood of the piece. Likewise, it might be played up in the high key notes, and that's also the mood of the piece. Sometimes it's all over the place and it uses a wide range. So it goes from deep to high and back to deep again. And it's that change, that radical change, gives it drama. So drama in a painting often comes from extremes used in a painting. Extreme use of color from one end to the other of the spectrum, or extreme, very, very light, very, very dark. And harmony and peacefulness or whatever is often used whenever you have the very limited range of tone, just like sound. Likewise, how that tone changes is important. If you try to liken it to music again, if you have someone playing the piano and they're playing down in the low notes and they work their way slowly up the notes until they get to the high piece, there's a drama and there's an interest there, but it's not a sudden shock because they've worked through various tones to get from one place to the other. If that same pianist is playing on the high notes and suddenly from in one swoop lifts their hands and dives straight down from the high straight down to the big low notes and leave the middle section out, it's a shock to us. It's a sudden jolt from one extreme to the other, and that extreme again creates a sense of drama and surprise or whatever. So exactly the same happens visually. If we see things in extremes, then it visually shocks us, if you want to use that term. But if things are very limited and within a very small range, it's a happier family of tone, and therefore the mood that we get from that piece of drawing or painting is a different mood. So what I've done is just to illustrate this. If I could just find the little PowerPoint here that I had, here it is. So if we were to look at this, let's just make it full scale for you, okay? So this first example is Claude Monet. It's the Parliament buildings in London, 1902 this is. And you can see the tonal range. Now we're looking at these in color at the moment, but you can see that there's an atmosphere in that picture. You know, we'd all agree that it's got an atmosphere. It's a sunset, or you know, it's a dusk part of the day, perhaps the low light. But if we try to analyze it, we will see that, is there a range of tone? Yes, there is. There are quite dark tones within the building, not super dark, you know, but they're reasonably dark. And there's a lighter sky. Now, generally the sky and the water are lighter than the buildings, but they're not extremely sudden. There is a difference, but it's not a super wide range. It's wide enough to give us a sense of their silhouette, but they're closer than maybe they seem at first glance. If we go, for example, to another piece of work by Turner, this is a beautiful piece of work, in my opinion, is considering, you know, how long ago this would have been done. But look at the atmosphere in that. Certainly there's an atmosphere, a hazy, misty sort of landscape. I think it's called Landscape with a Castle or something. So in amongst all this, there may be a building as well, but it is that very, very hazy. Now, what's interesting about that, we could say, yes, there's a range of tone from very, very bright to a little bit there of dark. And that's interesting, the amounts of each. It's predominantly light, and even the lower bottom left is fairly light. The only dark extreme is in this bottom right, really of any significance, and a small amount on the left here, which kind of balances that. But in terms of volume, there isn't a tremendous amount. The other thing we notice is that the tones change gently. What I mean by that, it doesn't go from light to middle to dark with a quick jolt. It you know, there's a transition. There's very light, then there's slightly darker again, and so on. There's lots of tones in this, is what I'm saying. There's a very wide range of different tones taking us up and down, if you like, that piano, very slowly and gradually. So there is no shock, as it were. So therefore the atmosphere tends to be more still and quiet, even though it's got a mood to it. It's not a shock. Our eyes are led gradually around the tones because they're not black and white, literally. Have a look at this now, Rembrandt, self-portrait, of course, and using a term that was known as chiaroscuro, which is basically light and shade, was a very popular method of painting, and it's using light and shade in fairly extreme ways. You know, his face is essentially in shadow, and there's just that little piece of light on his cheek and on his nose, apart from maybe the background here a little bit. But essentially, there's very, very dark and there's very light, and there aren't too many intermediate tones. So the darkest goes from the darkest to the lightest very quickly. A bit like having a spotlight on your face or on something, and that's exactly what chiaroscuro was about, the drama of theatrical lighting. So you can see that even where you can see his eyes, the darkness in his eyes is very similar to the darkness in the skin and the darkness in the hair. So there's not a lot of variation here. You could almost draw a line around that area of his hair and skin, and then diagonally across that, draw a line around this piece, and they're almost like two sections. If you half close your eyes and look at that picture, it will split into essentially like 2 or 3 bits of tone. And that tone changes fairly suddenly. It's not a soft, gentle, gradual change like the Turner. It's a sudden. So therefore, with that comes a visual shock, or the drama, if you like. And that's where mood comes from. That's how we, as artists, create mood. We control the tone, we control the amount of tone, and we control the degree by which that tone changes, the pace by which that tone changes. Now what I've done is taken these 3 paintings, I've taken a strip, as if I'd cut a strip out of them. I'll show you now. Little samples so that we can see them not as painting, as just a sample of tone. There is the Monet along the top. So look at the tonal, they're in black and white, by the way, so that we can do this. So the change in tone, yes, it's noticeable, but it's not pure black-white, if you like. It's not extreme dark and extreme light, but there is a change. You will see that the change from that shape to that is quite crisp. It's dark to light changes fairly suddenly. So it has those qualities. Come to the Turner, look at this. If we start on the left, it gradually moves through slightly darker, very, very slightly darker, and takes us through to the darker tone, and then step by step gets a little bit lighter, a little bit lighter, a little bit lighter, and then back to dark. So the transition is soft and gentle, and the range of tone is fairly limited. It's predominantly light. It's light most of the way. There is a bit of dark here, but even the dark again isn't extremely black. So it's a different set of qualities within the way Turner has made his tones and light. Then we come down to the final one, which is Rembrandt. And there we have a predominantly dark sample. And we have a little flash there and maybe a little flash here, but you know, that little flash of light there, it's just an example of the sorts of tones and how they might have arranged them. So here you have a dark sample with a sudden flash of light, and maybe a sudden little flash of light there, but small amounts of light in a big amount of dark. Whereas the Turner is dark, small amounts of dark in a big amount of light, but a soft transition and a more sudden transition here. And therefore, the mood of each of the three pictures is slightly different. So these are the things we need to control as artists. Not enough to say, I want a moody painting, so I'll make it dark. That necessarily may not make a moody painting. It'll make a dark painting, but it may not be quite the mood you want. You know, so do you want it predominantly dark with a little light? Or do you want it suddenly dark and suddenly light? And all those things, just like the pianist playing, will make us listen to different types of music, different types of mood. What I've got here is just a little experiment with light, or the illusions of light and tone. Of course, these go hand in hand. I've drawn here, painted a very simple set of objects, two objects, a little bottle shape, a little apple or a little piece of fruit or whatever on an imaginary table, but all painted with one mid-gray. So tonally, they're somewhere in the middle of things, if you like. And what I just wanted to do was see what would happen if I made adjustments to the tones in and around it. So obviously at the minute, what we have is an image that has quite extreme. So in other words, you know, that tone and the white of the background and the white of this label, if you like, are very extreme. They're not quite black and white, but they're very close. If I was to take some paint, and what I've done here is mix up some gray paint, which is not unlike the color that's already here. It's slightly lighter. It's very transparent. So in other words, it's see-through. And I'm just going to paint across the whole thing with this dilute paint. So you can see what's happening there. It's like a varnish, if you like, going across the whole thing. And it takes a little moment or two to get that coverage, but it's beginning to go now. And you will see some reflections in a minute, perhaps, but hopefully we're going to come back to this when it's dry and see how that has changed this notion of tone and light. We talked earlier about the range of light that exists and how quickly it changes. So even now, perhaps you can see that the tones that are in that are much more similar, closer together. What's in and around the objects and in amongst them is similar. What we've done is pull it together. We've unified it by giving it a wash of one color, one tone rather, one light across the whole thing. So therefore the bottle and the apple have taken on a little bit of that, and the background has taken on a little bit of that. So we're going to come back to that in a moment, and when it dries, and just to see how that changes, if you like, the atmosphere. You can see now that this has dried slightly more, that the tonal range is more limited. So we've changed from this extreme tone to slightly more similar tone. So it's a closer family of tone, if you like. And you can see, I hope, some feeling of the sense of light. If you could imagine light being on these objects, how it's different to the experience we had earlier when it was simply a dark light set of objects. Now what I'm going to do here now is try something and hopefully it'll work, but I'll try it anyway. What I want to do is put a very dark wash over this whole thing and remove some bits of it. So in other words, I want to push the tone down the scale, as it were, on the piano to the dark area, and then remove small amounts of light and see how that changes it. So this I hope will work, but the only way to do these things is to do them. So I'm gonna put nearly black, not quite, wash over everything here. And I'm working fairly quickly with acrylics, as you know, can dry fairly fast. And what I'm gonna do, I'll just make that more even. And what I'm going to do, maybe with brushes and with bits of tissue, maybe, or just remove the bits that I know that were underneath there. So I'm going to just get quite messy here, remove bits there, and find where I was with the little piece of apple or whatever. And this will come together, I will say, with great confidence. And then I'm going to put the black over the top of that again, and I'm going to just gently wash over that again. And I just want enough light to creep through these objects to let them appear in chiaroscuro, as it were. You know, if you remember back to the picture I showed you there of Rembrandt's portrait. And what I'm going to do is take a little bit of tissue here, maybe try to knock out a wee bit more light on the edge of that. Sorry, I've just gone too far. Actually, it works, but put a wee bit of black over that crumpled the paper slightly there, so I'll not push that too much. I'll take a brush maybe and try it down here. Just remove a wee bit more there. And just perhaps maybe a little bit on the bottom there. And we'll leave it there. I'll not push it because it's cheap card that I'm working on, and it can disappear very quickly. So we'll leave that for a second to dry, and let the reflections and whatever settle down, and have a look at that also. So here is the result of my experiment here. You can see the black wash across that, and the little bits of light that I've sponged away there. Looks very squiggly and wishy-washy. So what I've done is I've actually cropped the pictures. If I can find it here, I'll bring this up. There is a cropped version of what I've just done there. You can see the bottle and the little piece of fruit. And you know what happens here when I completely covered the drawing, the painting, in black paint, and then lifted bits away. Now the cardboard was disintegrating slightly, but if you look at that, I'm really quite happy with this illusion of that piece of fruit, that apple, whatever it is, coming out of the darkness, like the Rembrandt. and likewise the bottle, you know, light bits emerging from the darkness and the mood that that creates. So a very simple experiment like that on a very small scale is a way to play with light and try things with light. If I go to the other one, I'll click over here now uh, and bring up that one, the one we did first, where it was just a gray wash across the whole thing. Obviously slightly different. This has a haziness. This is more of a quality, the hazy light that maybe was in the Monet, the painting I showed you of Parliament buildings. But certainly you can see by washing across images and then removing and so on, you can go from that to this and create different moods through the use of light and shade. Hopefully these little samples and short demonstrations have encouraged you to think about how light behaves, but more importantly, that it's not a simple thing. It's something that has subtleties and a range of possibilities. So when you look at objects, look at all the complex variations of light that exist in them. Literally, it's not a case of black and white. And when you make drawings and paintings, think about the values that you apply, how light you create your object, how dark, what's going on in between that. It's not enough sometimes unless you match the light exactly or closely, because then the atmosphere and the spatial illusions won't happen. So it's quite a carefully controlled thing, just like color mixing is, that one little spot too much of one color will change the color completely and you might never get it again. Likewise, when you're applying tone and light to the environment in a painting and drawing, you have to be very, very careful with what you select. So hopefully you enjoy the video. Hopefully it's helpful, and go and practice some of those things that you've seen.